You know how sometimes you feel like to really understand the big issues in the world, you'd have to spend your whole life reading?
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh, how can I even begin to grasp all of this stuff?
Yeah, it's super overwhelming.
Yeah. What if instead of that, there was a way to get like those key insights in a much more focused way?
Welcome to the deep dive.
What if, right? Today we're diving into exactly that, efficient understanding.
Ooh, I like that.
We're calling it
Hit me with it.
mindful moments.
Oh, good.
Not just like, those fleeting thoughts you have, but like these concentrated bursts of clarity on these complex subjects.
Okay, so really laser focused, right?
Exactly. The
Okay.
goal is to like extract powerful knowledge without being totally overloaded with information.
I love it.
Right.
Have you ever noticed how some things just seem to repeat themselves throughout history?
Yeah, like what do you mean?
Well, like the idea that inequality is just like a natural part of human societies, that it's always been this way and there's nothing we can really do about it.
I see what you mean. That's a pretty common assumption.
Yeah.
But what if it's not actually true?
That's what we're going to explore today.
So we're diving into some fascinating ideas from Thomas Piketty's book, A Brief History of Equality.
And this book suggests a very different story.
It suggests a really long and complex journey toward greater equality.
Right, but with lots of bumps along the way.
So yeah, Piketty's main argument is that there has been this long-term tendency toward greater equality.
Since about the 18th century.
Yeah, since around the 18th century.
Yeah.
But it's not like some smooth upward trajectory.
No, not at all. It's more like, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing.
Exactly. It's this uneven progress with, persistent inequalities popping up.
Like those stubborn weeds in your garden.
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
in areas like wealth and status, even down to things like, where you're born and what opportunities you have based on that.
And that's such a crucial point, right? Recognizing that this long-term trend towards equality doesn't mean we can just sit back and relax.
Oh, yeah, absolutely not. If anything, it's an invitation to really dig into the past and learn from it.
Because by understanding how progress has been made before, well, we can hopefully make even more progress in the future.
Right. We're not destined to just repeat the same patterns.
So one of the most compelling ideas from Piketty is this notion that inequality isn't some sort of fixed law of the universe.
It's not like gravity or something.
Right, like it's not inevitable.
Yeah.
Instead, he argues that it's something we, as humans, have actually constructed.
So it's socially constructed, historically constructed, even politically constructed.
Which is kind of empowering in a way when you think about it.
It is.
Yeah.
Because if it's something we've built, it means we can also choose to rebuild it differently.
Exactly. So how we organize our economies, our legal systems, our education systems.
All of those things. Those are all choices we've made as societies.
And they've had huge consequences for who benefits and who gets left behind.
Exactly. So, for any given level of technological advancement or economic development.
Different societies have chosen really different paths.
Yeah, when it comes to things like property ownership and how resources are distributed.
And those choices really reflect the power dynamics at play, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
It's not just about abstract economic theories.
Mm-hmm.
It's about who holds the power and what ideas dominate at any given time.
And whose voices are heard and whose are silenced.
It's about, who writes the history books, literally.
Right. And as Piketty emphasizes, creating wealth has never been a solo act. It's always been this collective endeavor.
Absolutely. It relies on things like global cooperation, the sharing of knowledge.
And the contributions of countless individuals across generations.
Yeah, all building on what came before.
But so we've talked about this long-term trend towards equality, but it hasn't been this, straight line upwards.
No, definitely not. We've seen some major leaps forward in areas like education and healthcare, which is amazing.
And that's not just about improving living standards. It's about recognizing the inherent worth and the needs of all people.
It's a really profound shift in how we think about each other.
But even within these victories, we often see new forms of inequality emerge, right?
Right, yeah. So, for example, expanding access to basic education doesn't automatically guarantee equal access to higher education.
Or even the same quality of education for everyone.
It's like that constant struggle, like striving for this perfect democracy, always working towards something better.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Yeah, exactly. It's a journey, not a destination. And it makes you question, like, how do we even define progress?
Like, is it just about economic growth? Is it just about GDP?
Right, because just looking at those numbers, those economic growth figures like GDP, can actually be pretty misleading.
Yeah, they don't tell the whole story.
No, not at all. And that's why Piketty suggests we should pay more attention to something called national income.
Which sounds kind of technical, but it's actually pretty intuitive when you think about it.
It is, because national income takes into account things like the depletion of natural resources, which GDP often ignores.
So, for example, imagine a country that makes a ton of money by, I don't know, maybe like mining some rare mineral or something.
Yeah, I'm following you.
Their GDP might look fantastic on paper, but if that resource can't be replaced, well, their long-term prospects might not be so rosy.
Right, that's the missing piece. And national income tries to capture that fuller picture.
Tries to account for the costs as well as the benefits.
Exactly. And that's also why a truly comprehensive view of progress needs to include environmental indicators.
Things like carbon emissions targets, biodiversity goals.
Yeah, because you can't just put a price tag on everything.
Right, like trying to assign a monetary value to something like clean air or a stable climate.
It just doesn't capture the full scope of the problem.
And it can create this illusion that we can just buy our way out of environmental destruction.
Right, which just isn't true. And on top of that, it's crucial to acknowledge that even those environmental costs are distributed really unequally.
Yeah, it's not like everyone's contributing equally to climate change or bearing the consequences equally.
Not even close.
Yeah.
A small fraction of the world's population is responsible for the vast majority of emissions.
And yet it's often the most vulnerable communities that suffer the worst effects of climate change.
Yeah, and face the most difficult challenges in adapting to a changing world.
And to really grasp these power dynamics, who benefits and who loses out, Piketty encourages us to look at patterns of ownership.
To really examine who owns what.
And he breaks it down into these key categories. The means of production.
Which is basically all the stuff you need to create wealth.
Then you have housing.
The state itself.
And then any assets held in other countries.
So let's break down means of production a little bit.
Okay, so that includes things like factories, land.
Yeah, natural resources, machinery, even intellectual property like patents and copyrights.
And then financial assets like stocks and bonds.
All that stuff that allows people to generate income and accumulate wealth.
Right, and housing, as we see in places like France.
Often makes up a big chunk of an individual's wealth.
And then the state itself, that's a whole other layer of ownership, right?
It is, because it involves things like public infrastructure, land, and all sorts of assets that, in theory, belong to the citizens.
Right. And the final category, assets held in other countries, that gets into the whole world of global finance.
Yeah. So a country might own assets in other countries, like foreign companies or real estate.
But it can also have foreign ownership within its own borders.
Exactly. And looking at the net balance of those assets can tell you a lot about a country's economic position in the world.
So one of the striking things that Piketty highlights is just how unequally all this ownership is distributed.
Oh, yeah. And it's pretty stark.
Like in France, for instance, the poorest 50% of the population owns just a tiny sliver of the total wealth.
Yeah, it's a really small fraction.
While the richest 1% holds this disproportionately huge share.
Right. And that kind of concentration of ownership translates into real economic and political power.
It shapes who gets to make decisions and whose interests are prioritized.
And it's not a static picture either. Like, we can see these historical shifts in how wealth is distributed.
So, for example, in France, wealth actually became less concentrated after World War I, which benefited the middle class.
Yeah, there was a real leveling effect.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that trend reversed in the 1980s.
And income distribution followed a similar pattern. After both world wars, we saw this decrease in inequality.
Which then started to climb again in more recent decades.
It's like this constant push and pull between forces that concentrate wealth and those that try to distribute it more evenly.
It really is. And when we're talking about the historical roots of inequality, we can't ignore colonialism.
Yeah, it's impossible to understand how wealth and power are distributed today without acknowledging the legacy of colonialism.
Absolutely. The exploitation of resources and labor in places like the Americas and Asia played a huge role in the economic rise of Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries.
And this wasn't just about trade or cultural exchange. We're talking about outright theft and violence on a massive scale.
Yeah, this was about European powers using their military might to extract wealth from other parts of the world.
So European commercial companies like the British and Dutch East India companies, they often use military force to get what they wanted.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the Opium Wars.
Right.
Where European powers forced China to open its markets to opium.
Which had devastating consequences for Chinese society.
Yeah, and this was essentially armed robbery on a global scale.
But it's also important to ask, why did Europe gain this dominance in the first place?
Right, because while colonialism was central to its rise, it wasn't the only factor.
So things like competition between European states,
Yeah, their internal political structures,
geopolitical rivalries, even religious motivations played a role.
like the rivalry between Europe and the Islamic world.
So colonialism wasn't just about economics, it was about creating new states and imposing social structures.
Yeah, often controlled by a dominant minority.
And often with discriminatory systems put in place to control and exploit the local populations.
Right. And colonial societies, especially those based on slavery, like Saint-Domingue.
Which is present-day Haiti.
Right, yeah. They were some of the most unequal societies in history.
Because you had this tiny group of colonists who controlled almost all the land and resources.
And then this vast population of enslaved people who were treated as property and denied basic human rights.
And it's almost ironic how many of these colonizing nations were promoting ideals of liberty and equality at home,
while simultaneously denying those very same rights to people in their colonies.
It's a really stark contrast.
Yeah, and France is a great example of this, despite its Republican values.
France maintained a colonial empire with widespread racial and religious discrimination.
Yeah, and that continued right up until the mid-20th century.
So you had things like segregated school systems, unfair legal systems,
and a whole range of policies designed to keep the colonized populations in a subordinate position.
And the financial systems in these colonies were often structured to benefit the colonizers.
Right, so you had things like regressive taxes.
Which disproportionately impacted the poorest members of society.
Yeah, and educational opportunities were far more limited in the colonies compared to the colonizing countries.
So it's clear that the legacy of colonialism continues to shape global inequalities today.
Absolutely. We can't understand the present without grappling with the past.
Now, shifting gears a bit, the book also delves into how societies have evolved over time, looking at the role of revolution, status, and class.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these forces interact.
So, for example, the French Revolution, it's often held up as this turning point in history.
Yeah, a moment when the old order was overthrown.
And it did dismantle the formal privileges of the nobility in 1789.
Like their special legal rights and tax exemptions.
But it didn't immediately erase their social standing or their wealth.
Right, so the nobility might have lost their titles and their political power, but they often held on to their land and their economic influence for quite some time.
And how we think about dominant classes has also changed over time.
Yeah, like back in the day, there was this idea of society being divided into these three main groups, the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else.
And each group had its specific role to play.
Right. So the clergy provided spiritual guidance, the nobility served as warriors and protectors, and the commoners, well, they did most of the work.
But over time, that view shifted.
It did. It moved towards a more capitalist perspective.
Where the focus is on those who own property and generate profit.
And often with the state's backing.
So the dominant class became less about inherited status and more about economic power.
Exactly. And we see this reflected in the gradual expansion of voting rights in Europe.
Because as more people gained the right to vote,
the balance of power shifted away from the old elites.
And just to illustrate how extreme wealth inequality was in Europe before World War I.
Yeah, wow. Like in the Belle Epoque, that period from the late 19th century to the early 20th century.
The top 1% of the population in countries like France and the UK controlled an absolutely staggering amount of wealth.
Like way more than we see even today.
And what's really interesting is that a lot of the progress towards greater equality has actually involved challenging or even breaking existing legal frameworks.
So it hasn't always been this smooth, incremental process.
No, it's often taken these moments of rupture, these moments of revolution.
Yeah, and think about examples like the French Revolution, obviously.
But also the struggles over the power of the House of Lords in the UK.
Right, or even Roosevelt's battles with the Supreme Court in the U.S. during the New Deal era.
And even the way that Europe rebuilt after World War I, including some instances of debt cancellation.
Those are all examples of moments where the old rules were challenged and new possibilities opened up.
And those moments often came about because of immense social and political pressure.
Yeah, it took people organizing and demanding change.
Now, another real significant period that Piketty focuses on is the rise of the welfare state.
And this was a really transformative era.
Yeah, between 1914 and 1980, many Western countries saw this huge expansion in the role of government.
Both in the economy and in people's lives,
And we saw this dramatic increase in tax revenues.
which allowed governments to do a lot more.
And this wasn't just about providing charity or helping those in need. It was about a fundamental shift in the state's responsibilities.
It was about actively promoting social well-being.
So government started making massive investments in education, healthcare, infrastructure.
And this led to greater access to these essential services for a much wider segment of the population.
The U.S. actually led the way in expanding access to secondary education pretty early on.
Yeah, that's interesting. And crucially, this expansion of the state was largely driven by the lower and middle classes.
Right, through democratic processes like voting and organizing into labor unions and political parties.
Yeah, the rise of labor movements and progressive political parties was really instrumental in this transformation.
And it showed that essential services like healthcare and education didn't have to be solely governed by market forces.
And, for folks who are interested in diving deeper into topics like this, I actually recommend checking out Mindful Moments and our podcasts on YouTube.
That's a great suggestion.
It's an AI audiobook analysis channel that explores all sorts of insightful books and ideas.
Yeah, and I think our listeners would really appreciate their thought-provoking analysis.
Yeah, they do some great work over there.
So now let's talk about the power of progressive taxation.
Okay, yeah, this is a key part of the story.
Because between 1914 and 1980, taxing higher incomes and wealth at higher rates became this really powerful tool.
It was a way to reshape capitalism and make it more equitable.
And during this period, top tax rates reached surprisingly high levels in some countries.
Even with conservative governments in power.
Yeah, it's a common myth that those high tax rates were never really implemented or that they didn't work.
But the historical evidence suggests otherwise.
Especially when you consider just how concentrated wealth was at the beginning of the 20th century.
Right, like we were talking about earlier with the Belle Epoque.
So taxing income and inheritances progressively played a huge role in reducing wealth inequality during this period.
It was a really effective way to redistribute wealth and create a more level playing field.
And the impact of progressive taxation wasn't just about what happened after people earned money.
It was also about shaping economic behavior beforehand.
So the very existence of these taxes could influence things like executive pay.
And how much wealth people sought to accumulate.
This is sometimes called pre-distribution,
And the U.S. had a very progressive tax system during this mid-20th century period.
which unfortunately has become less so since the 1980s.
And that shift has definitely contributed to the rise in inequality that we've seen in recent decades.
Now, the reduction in the wealth share of the richest after the World Wars wasn't solely due to taxation, of course,
Right, there were other factors at play too.
like the physical destruction of capital during the wars,
And policies aimed at limiting the power of property owners.
as well as the liquidation of foreign assets and public debts.
All of those things played a role.
But ultimately, a progressive tax system relies on this shared belief,
This belief that it's a fair way to fund collective needs.
and that we all have a responsibility to contribute to the well-being of society.
That's the social contract.
But sadly, we've seen some of those gains eroded in recent decades.
We have.
And Piketty argues that things like financial deregulation and the ease of moving capital across borders,
Those have really weakened some of those equalizing forces that were at work during that mid-20th century period.
and so rebuilding that public belief in fair taxation and in investing in our collective well-being.
That's going to be essential for making further progress towards a more just and equitable society.
Yeah, it's not going to happen on its own.
No, we've got to actively work for it.
So Piketty suggests that renewing progressive taxation is probably necessary for any further big steps towards, a more socialized approach to wealth.
Yeah, where wealth is seen as something that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
And he also brings up this idea of a universal basic inheritance.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting concept.
So basically, everyone would receive a certain amount of inheritance when they reach adulthood,
Regardless of their family background.
which could help level the playing field and give everyone a fairer start in life.
It would be a huge shift,
And then there's this model of participatory socialism.
where workers have a greater say in how businesses are run.
Yeah, so it's not just about who owns the capital, but about who has the power to make decisions.
And it's about recognizing the value and contributions of all stakeholders in an enterprise.
Not just the shareholders.
Exactly. And in our increasingly interconnected world, we can't ignore the importance of international cooperation.
Because tackling global inequalities and tax evasion, those are issues that require coordinated global action.
We can't solve them in isolation.
And so Piketty's book really encourages us to revisit the lessons of that mid-20th century period.
To look back at how the welfare state and progressive taxation were used to create more equitable societies.
Because those are tools and ideas that are still incredibly relevant today.
They are.
But we also need to learn from the mistakes that were made.
Yeah, why those gains were eroded in some cases and what we can do differently moving forward.
And the emergence of different models, like China's state-controlled approach to economic development.
That presents a real challenge to those more democratic, decentralized models that Piketty advocates for.
Right, because it raises questions about the trade-offs between efficiency and equity.
And about the role of the state versus the market in shaping a just and prosperous society.
So Piketty suggests that a democratic form of socialism,
Yeah, one that's participatory, decentralized, environmentally conscious, and inclusive.
that could be the logical next step in this long journey towards greater equality.
It would be a huge leap forward.
But it's not going to happen without a lot of hard work and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And it will require new forms of international cooperation and democratic oversight of powerful institutions, like financial institutions.
So we've really taken a journey today,
We have,
tracing this long and winding road towards equality.
with all its twists and turns.
We've seen those moments of incredible progress, driven by social movements, by visionary policies.
And by shifts in how societies view fairness and justice.
But we've also seen those persistent inequalities and the emergence of new challenges in our ever-evolving globalized world.
Yeah, it's an ongoing struggle.
And so Piketty leaves us with this really thought-provoking question.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Considering this long history of striving for a more equal world,
A world where everyone has a fair shot.
what are some of the inequalities that we take for granted today
Those things that seem normal to us now.
that future generations will look back on and say, wow, how could they have ever thought that was okay?
That's something to ponder. It's a call to action for all of us.
It is. So if you found today's exploration valuable, I encourage you to subscribe to the show for more insightful deep dives like this.
Yeah, and share it with your friends, family, anyone who might be interested in these big ideas.
And if you want to delve even deeper into Piketty's work, you can purchase A Brief History of Equality through the link in the show notes.
It's well worth a read.
But most importantly, keep engaging with these ideas. Keep thinking critically. Keep having conversations about how we can build a more just and equitable world.
Because the future isn't predetermined. It's something we create together.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me today. It's been a fascinating conversation.
My pleasure. Always happy to dive into these important topics.
And to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world. We'll see you next time.
Until then.